So now we move on to consider Southern agriculture in the so-called New South. And I guess if you're wondering, why does he call it the New South, or does he, kind of hedge his bets when he says New South? In some ways, there have been many New Souths since the Civil War. But when I use the term New South, I'm really focused on that late 19th century post-Civil War South up through, I guess, the early 20th century or so. Well, back to farming and back to agriculture in the New South. Immediately after the Civil War, as slaves were emancipated, as the Union armies moved through and slaves left plantations, I think one of the key questions had to do with how would the South obtain the labor necessary to grow these commercial crops. And you have to imagine, I think, that's one of the things historians do, but you have to imagine that you're a Confederate veteran now, and you've seen the defeat on the battlefield, and you're making your way home, and all around you, you kind of can see the effects of the war that's just been fought and the decimation, so much perhaps of what you'd known is gone. And you finally get back home only to find, perhaps, I think it happened for many veterans, that one, their neighborhood, their towns, their community had been changed by the war, the loss of life, etc. But how many of them came home to find the bulk of their livestock gone, either carried off by Confederate or Union armies in need of horses or oxen or mules? How many veterans come home to find, well, gee, there's no way to even start the process of clearing fields that have grown up. There's no way to start. The slaves are gone. I mean, how do you start again? It requires a whole sort of rethinking. And yet, often what we see looking at the early post-Civil War years is an effort to reestablish very quickly the traditional ways in which labor and farming were organized. One of the examples that I'll bring up again is the Black Codes. The Black Codes were designed to put African Americans and freedmen back to work, largely in agriculture, because this demand for labor existed and because slave owners had been used to controlling labor before the war. Now that's over. So you turn to the state, you turn to the Black Codes themselves and the legal system. But also in terms of the way labor was to be used early after the war, we see similarities with the way labor was used under slavery. And one term that you might want to know here is the notion of the gang labor system. It denies sort of individual work, instead assigning tasks and having, particularly under slavery, having slaves operate as a group. The completion of that task set the tone for the day, and people worked without, or were forced to work without any sense of individuality. They worked as a gang. And you can see that continuing in the New South when you look at, for instance, convict labor, often forced to work task-based systems as a gang. But also quite early on, we begin to see the rejection, too, of the old gang labor system. And it's one of the sort of fascinating stories of Southern agriculture after the Civil War as to how a new system of labor arrangement emerges. Now, ultimately, what I'm going to be talking about is something called sharecropping. And I'll go into some detail in a moment. But for now, let me remind you of a few things. First of all, understand that the capital vacuum of the South is huge for the Southern planter. This planter may, if they're sort of lucky, still control land, but they do not have access to the capital resources to really easily pay wage labor. And without slavery, of course, that's what you're going to depend upon in the 1860s and 70s. You're going to have to find a way to come up with wages unless you can find an alternative. The South had been capital poor really even before the war, with fewer banks and less assets than you might have seen in the American or United States North or other portions of the country. But to sort of further complicate matters, consider that by the 1870s, U.S. fiscal policy or financial policy is already pulling back currency, the availability of currency for circulation. And in particular here, I have in mind the so-called greenbacks that were printed during the war years when the need was extremely great for circulating currency and credit. By the early 1870s, again, the U.S. is going back or pulling back toward the gold standard. And that's where you have gold backing all paper currency and serving as a standard of value for that currency. It had often been the case in U.S. economics that any paper currency or note, whether national, state, or local bank produced, was to be backed by gold in such a way that if I came to a bank, for instance, and turned in the note, I should be able to redeem that note for the value in gold, in specie, bullion, in real material wealth. As the United States moves toward more conservative fiscal policies, Southerners who are now absolutely capital poor, who have limited access to credit, will kind of suffer the result. And it's from that tension, the need for labor, but the inability to pay labor, that perhaps we began to see the evolution of this thing called sharecropping. Now, essentially, sharecroppers would have been renters. They don't, as labor, have land. But what they have to offer, of course, is hard work or work. They have labor. And so, as sharecropping evolves, both the laborer in the South and the landowner in the South get something out of the arrangement. And in fact, that's often the term that was used for this relationship between landowner and laborer. They would kind of yearly come to arrangements. They would arrive at a preconditioned sort of agreement as to what each party owed to the other. So unlike slavery, we're talking about a situation that is contractual. The legal system here is playing a role. Now, as a laborer, of course, I don't have land. And so I've got to sell, I've got my work, and I'm getting something out of this too. But often, and this is a point worth making, I'll talk about more in a moment, often these arrangements are working to my disadvantage. In other words, it's not always going to work out well for me. And I'll explain that in just a second. The way sharecropping basically worked in terms of rental. Now, in the South, you could outright rent land. In most farming areas, that's been the case. I mean, suppose that I have a little extra set aside and I decide that I want to grow more this year, more corn, more cotton, whatever it may be. But I don't own the land outright to do that. One thing I could do is go to my neighbor and say, hey, I see you're not putting out as much acreage this year and you're going to have some surplus acreage. Would you mind if maybe I paid you a certain amount and you let me plant a crop in your fields or on your land? That idea of renting for pay, much as you would rent an apartment or rent a house or rent any item, that's pretty straightforward. Sharecropping works on a similar principle, but it doesn't involve, per se, the exchange of money. Instead, it's the exchange of labor for use of land, and then the sharing of what's produced as a result of that relationship. So, for instance, in the South, sort of the way it worked, if I'm lucky enough to have perhaps my own livestock, I'm willing to buy seed to get a crop started. If I have a plow or other equipment, whatever I may bring to this contractual relationship, but if I have material to bring, then I might get as much as half the crop, so that I, as the cropper, get half, and then the landowner gets half. If I'm bringing very little to the agreement, as the laborer, as the cropper, I may only come away with a third of the crop. And out of that, consider that I'm going to have to pay for living expenses, what it's going to cost me if I have a family, what it's going to cost me to support that family over the course of the year while I wait for the next crop to come in. And there'll be other expenses along the way. For instance, I can sell my cotton, but I'm going to have to probably pay ginning fees to have the cotton ginned and processed so it can be sold and then shipped. There may be other expenses along the way that I'll have to consider. That's going to come out of what I make off my crop. And ultimately, what I make off the crop comes from settling up, as it was called, with the landowner when we kind of divide the crop. Now, for the landowner, the issue is one of dependency. And by that I mean that the landowner becomes dependent upon the production of this tenant, the person doing the renting or sharecropping, dependent upon the production of the tenant for what they'll actually make out of this deal. So there's still an impetus for a landowner to push tenants to produce. And you could argue tenants themselves have some impetus or push to produce as much as they can because they want to make as much as they can off the crop. But the point there has to do with oversight, because that's what changes. And sometimes you can see that in spatial terms. I have a map that I often use showing a plantation and showing it pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. And the post-Civil War reflects the changing shape or spatial relationships, how things are related to each other in space on that plantation with sharecropping in place. Before the war, you have a main house, you have slave quarters, which are very, very near the main house so that they can be viewed directly and overseen. And you have a gin house where the ginning of the cotton, say, takes place. After the war, the pattern changes. The main house, the plantation house, stays where it has been. The gin house stays where it has been. But instead of sort of rows of slave cabins, what you have are houses scattered across the plantation. These are houses scattered in a way that they're not necessarily in the direct view of the plantation owner, the landowner. Instead, they offer to tenants, to sharecroppers, a certain amount of freedom, of independence from the immediate control of a landowner. But not total independence, not total freedom. The landowner still has an interest in his investment or her investment, and so they want at least some oversight of how hard the tenant's working and how the tenant is producing what they're producing. And often they will shape even what a tenant ends up growing. And I'll explain that in just a second too. But that spatial pattern, the change in the way space is used, is very telling about the relationship in terms of independence, in terms of economics, the relationship that tenancy or sharecropping reflects. Just very, very telling. I mentioned just a second ago, though, I mentioned this notion of how do you make a living? How do you keep your family going during the period of that year while you're waiting for your crop to come in? Because that's how you're going to make whatever money you make. And one other element here about the southern agricultural system, particularly in the cotton belt, particularly in those areas where commercial crops are most grown. One other element of that, and it is financial, it's related to capital, is the so-called crop lien. And I just want to go over this very quickly. Throughout large portions of the South, there existed so-called furnishing merchants, and that's a term you may want to know, furnishing merchants. And they could be planters, they could be the owners of country stores, whatever they might be. They basically extended capital to sharecroppers, to people in the community, so that they could purchase and have access to goods while they waited for that crop to come in. And then at the end of the year, if I'm a sharecropper, off of whatever I've made from my crop or my percentage of the crop, I've got to go to the furnishing merchant who's lent me money, and I've got to settle up. I've got to pay now the bill, usually with interest. When we talk about a crop lien, or the crop lien system, that furnishing merchant didn't just extend credit, out of the goodness of his or her heart. The idea is that your crop becomes forfeit if you can't pay off. You start thinking about that. That's what a lien is, right? Ultimately, you're signing away the right to real property in exchange for access to credit. Well, these furnishing merchants provide credit, and they often also provide the goods that these croppers and tenants would purchase, particularly in rural areas where there just wasn't any other opportunity or option as to where one buys. So for instance, I need bacon. Okay, I'm spending my time growing cotton. I need bacon, or I need cornmeal to make cornbread. Well, if that's the case, I've got to get it somewhere. I go to the furnishing merchant, I go to the crossroads country store owner, and I buy bacon, or I buy something I just can't make at home. He puts it down in a book as credit. The idea being that I'll pay back when my crop comes in, when I've got money. Anyway, what I hadn't told you yet is the common practice that existed of really running up prices and charging considerable rates of interest by these furnishing merchants. Prices grew at extraordinary rates. 100% to maybe 200% more than the wholesale value of a particular good. And, granted, you're probably out in the middle of nowhere oftentimes and you don't have any other options, but that's still fairly excessive markup on goods. It's really almost extortionary when you think about it. What begins to happen throughout portions of the South linked to this commercial economy, this commercial agriculture, is that croppers and tenants who come to rely on furnishing merchants to get by often find themselves increasingly stuck, trapped. The crop lien as a legal instrument places croppers, tenants, in what's known as debt peonage. It's essentially debt slavery, where you owe more at the end of a year's hard work than you did before you started. That every year you go out hopefully into the field thinking this will be the year I'm going to make it out. This will be the year I bring home the big profits and finally maybe can purchase some land and have my own farm. increasingly Southern farmers found themselves trapped in this cycle of debt. A system, a cycle to which they were really enslaved, certainly in peonage. What that means for me, at least, when I think about it, it's sort of a depressing picture. It's not true for all Southern farmers, but it was for many. People who worked hard, some who didn't, I suppose. Some of us don't. But a lot of people who worked awfully hard, and no matter how hard they tried or how smart they were, they just never got ahead. Part of the reason, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, is that old economic idea of supply and demand working to shape cost and return. The harder Southern farmers farmed, the more they worked, the greater volume they grew, the more of that product, whatever it may have been, cotton, corn, the value of that product, the more is on the market. That's called supply, right? The greater the supply of the product, if demand remains steady, then if you think what should happen to price, price should go down. Right? There's more supply available, so that person trying to sell their crop can't ask as much money, really. There's so much more competition. For Southern farmers, they faced the problem of the price of cotton over the course of the 19th century dropping precipitously. So that by the end of the 19th century, by the end of the 1800s, the price of cotton was cents per pound. More cotton came out of the South, was grown after the Civil War than before. As farmers turned to cotton as their salvation, and the more they grew unwittingly, the deeper they dug that hole. It was true for cotton farmers. It was true for people growing tobacco in the South. It was true in so many commercial crops. But the planter, too, had an interest in making that money, marketing crops, not growing food, right? The more food the sharecropper has to buy, the better off in some ways that you can control that cropper if you're the furnishing merchant, if you as a planter are providing daily needs. But really, when you think about it, it goes back to the planter through credit being able to tell the sharecropper ultimately what will be grown, and pushing croppers further and further into these sort of challenging markets in hopes the planter may have had of increased profits for himself. It is, I think, a somewhat dark picture that emerges, one where former slaves, freedmen, sharecroppers, often African American, but also often the kind of poor whites that we talked about earlier in these lectures, where they find themselves in this position of sharecropping, a population that grew and grew over the course of the 19th century in the South. It is rather a dark picture, but it provides important insight into how we might understand the other side of the New South, which is industrialization, following that national model that we see in the late 19th century with the Gilded Age and the rise of corporations.